Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our 23rd weekly Franczek webinar since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you so much for joining us. It truly has been amazing to be here with all of you through this time, and it's sort of hard to believe that it's back to school time already. But here we are, and for many districts, you've already had your first day of school or are gearing up to do so in the coming days or weeks. So today we wanted to talk with you about what are the lessons that have been learned in the first days and week of school that might be helpful to all of you as you begin this school year in the ongoing pandemic. Today on our panel, you'll recognize the familiar faces of Franczek attorneys and regular panelists, Jennifer Smith.
Hello.
Dana Fattore Crumley.
Hi, everybody.
And Shelli Anderson.
Hi, everyone.
And we are also giving a very warm welcome today to our special guest, PJ Caposey, Superintendent of Meridian School District 223. Welcome, PJ.
Thank you for having me.
So for any of you who are on Twitter, PJ will not need an introduction as he is a guiding voice for school leaders on that platform. Dr. Caposey is an award-winning practitioner and sought-after consultant and speaker specializing in school leadership, culture, and the change process for individuals and organizations. I also just happen to have his book here because I do often use it. A great book on time management if you're looking for one to get rid of COVID-19 bad habits, of which I personally have developed many. Meridian School District is also relatively unique in that it began school last week using a hybrid model, including in-person and remote instruction each week. So between all of those things, we knew that PJ was going to be able to provide great insights today, not just from his own district's experiences with back to school, but from those of the school leaders across the country for whom he provides regular guidance and mentoring. So thank you again for joining us, PJ. And as everyone knows from Twitter, you are quarantining, correct, right now?
Yes, we've got 3 of our 4 kids with a fever and some symptoms. Now, we've all gotten our test results back and we're negative, but we're still in the quarantine stage. So I am in my son's room. You can see the very professional background, which is as far away from the noise and chaos of having all the kids home.
Well, we are very grateful to have you here with us and definitely wishing your family a speedy recovery.
Thank you.
So a little bit of housekeeping before we jump in. Thank you to those of you who submitted questions during registration. We have worked those into our Q&A today, so hopefully we'll get to them all. Please do submit questions during the webinar today using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to cover all of them that come in. And please also feel free to use the Q&A today to share with us any insights you have learned if you're back to school. What experiences can we share with our other attendees today? You can put those in the Q&A as well. I do want to quickly highlight, as we always do, our topic for next week, which is FAPE in fall 2020. In which members of our amazing special education team will address all of the pressing special education questions that we know you've been dealing with these past weeks. So keep an eye out for a registration announcement soon and let us know if you have any questions by emailing us at covid@franczek.com. And as always, if you find yourself looking for more information or if we're not able to get to your questions today, please reach out to one of us. If you missed any of our webinars, you can find them all on our website under events at franczek.com. And while you're there, make sure to take a look around. We have many webinars, alerts, blogs, podcasts on a wide range of school law topics. So if you're looking to think about something other than COVID, we even have that covered as well. All right, so with all of that behind us, let's get going. So PJ, I know I gave a little intro, but can you tell us about your district and your community so that all of us have some background to work with?
Sure. We are small town rural in Northwest Illinois. So if Rockford was large enough to have suburbs, we'd be a southern suburb, but it's not, and we're not. But that's geographically where we're located. We're a unit district, 4 buildings, K2, 3, 5, 6, 8, and 9, 12. We're about 1,550 students and about 250 total staff members. Jackie, I think
How long have you been? Sorry, I hit end meeting instead of mute, which is not a good thing to hit when you're in charge of the webinar, but saved it. So How long have you been superintendent in this district and then in general?
Sure, this is my 8th year as superintendent and my 14th year in administration.
Now, can you tell us a little bit about, I know the question that most people are the most interested in hearing about, which is the framework that your district has come up with for your hybrid model. What does it look like at the different levels?
Sure, so I'll share some context in that originally our plan was to be full remote for those who chose it and to have full 5-day-a-week in-person instruction. For us, we determined we needed to have at least 25% of our students choose remote in order to for that option to work out safely. On our initial survey, it was 55-45 in terms of in-person versus remote, so we thought we could do that very easily. And then we asked people to commit to it for 6 weeks, and that number went from 55-45 to 85-15. So we had to come up with Plan B, which I don't think will be dissimilar from many people listening to this. There's been Plan A and B and C and D. So the hybrid model that we arrived at is all students that choose to, because we still have the full remote option, all students that choose to will have face-to-face instruction for 2 days per week and remote instruction for 3. And it looks a little bit different how we've structured it, K-5 compared to 6-8, and 6-8 different than 9-12. So if you, at the K-5 level, if you have Mrs. Smith for kindergarten, you would have her in person for Monday and Tuesday, then she remains your remote teacher for Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, so we're able to keep some consistency and continuity of learning for those kids. At the 6-8 level, we've been able to structure the day so that our students follow their normal schedule, and when they are in person, they might have, social studies first period, math second, English third, and then when they're remote, it's the same thing, same teacher, same classmates as they move through. So our teachers' experience then is that they're teaching, they might have first period face-to-face, second period Zoom or Google Meet, third period face-to-face, fourth period face-to-face, fifth Zoom. And at the high school level, we invested in a ton of streaming equipment, high quality streaming equipment. So our high school teachers just teach and their students attend again on the regular schedule. If their remote learners are attending synchronously, we have like 65 or 70-inch TVs in each classroom so that they can interact and the teachers can see who's in their Zoom meeting at the same time. So it's been a really interesting process because each level is a little bit different, so there's different complexities there. So far, it's going well. I wouldn't say it's been spotless, but it's been well, and it's been well received by the community.
I just knocked on wood for you, PJ.
Right.
Well, that's great. And so how does what you're doing compare to what other districts in your community or nearby are doing?
So it's interesting. I mean, the creep of going full remote is coming west, right? Like if you just kind of follow the trend. In our county, we have no full remote districts. So we are the only one using this model in our county. Some schools are full, just back face-to-face 5 days a week. Some are face-to-face 5 days a week, but at 4.5 or 5 hours. And then other schools are half day where the school kids are coming to school each day, but only attending for about 2 hours a day. So everyone's got different solutions to the same problem. And for the most part, people seem to, at this point, again, we're about 10 days of instruction in, seem to be pleased with the plan that they've created, despite the many complexities and the different iterations that have come forward.
All right, the title of our session today is Lessons Learned. So we thought we'd start out by asking you, PJ, what are the biggest lessons that you've learned that you can share with our attendees?
Number one is that the quarantine process is sizable and complex, and it's going to be largely out of your control. So we have a pretty good relationship with our health department. I know when I talk to my friends in the suburbs, the level of accessibility of our health administrator is dramatically different than what they're experiencing. I can just text them at 9 o'clock on a Sunday and get a response. I know that's not the experience that a lot of my friends are having. That said, when everyone got back to school, the communication has completely bogged down despite their best efforts. And the level of tracing and how it impacts your school is going to be dramatic. So in our instance, we're on day 8 of school. We've had 0 positive COVID cases that have attended school. So we had a couple in the summer, but no one has come to school, been symptomatic, and then been positive. And as it stands today, we have 50 people in quarantine. So again, we have 1,800 people on campus on a maximum capacity full traditional day. and we have 50 in quarantine already without a positive COVID case. So that trickle down of quarantine for when people get sick and have symptoms like my kids do right now is going to be a significant challenge to the logistical system. And so the biggest thing for us has been to try to learn what we can control and what we can influence, and kind of let everything else just be at peace, because there's going to be some decisions that I'm unable currently to predict what my health department's going to do. Like that flow chart, like we think we can follow it, but that's not necessarily what the health department's going to do. And so we've just had to learn to be at peace with the decisions they're making, whether they're being more conservative or more liberal in their approach to allowing kids back into school and staff.
So what would you say are the biggest challenges that you're facing or that you've seen since you've opened?
So I think what we're seeing is that there's numerous technological glitches that are going to happen as you ramp up and are providing different levels of tech service. The other thing is that your staff is coming into school exhausted. So typically when there's a school year, you have the initial surge of energy, and then it kind of wanes, and early November is tough, and then then you can see the end in sight, and you get to holiday break, and then February is rough again. Our teachers are already exhausted. So as resilient as they've been, our teachers have been an incredible partner throughout this entire process and planning and trying to put things together. They are tired, and stressors that normally wouldn't be large stressors are significant, and there's lots of tears, and it is an emotional roller coaster every day at work, which is just a different level of support and guidance and leadership that calls on school and district leaders to provide, that isn't necessarily what we're typically doing on day 8 and day 10 of instruction.
So I know that there are a lot of differences between school districts across the state, and so I thought next we'd go to our panel of attorneys to ask what lessons and challenges have you heard about in working with our clients and friends in these opening days or in the final days leading up to back to school? So Shelli, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in terms of the piece that's, I think, affecting the most districts that we've been working with is the ever-changing IDPH guidance that's coming out with respect to, it's really what PJ just mentioned, these quarantining rules and who has to isolate and when you have to isolate and what you need to come back to school in the event that you have to isolate. So we look at it from the student perspective, obviously, is one piece of it, but I think also, and we had a question come in during registration as well related to this, is how do you handle the staffing component to this? And really making sure that you are working actively with your unions as to what this is going to look like. Because, we do have some staff who are very reluctant to return to school. And we know that if you have a symptom, IDPH says that you need to quarantine or self-isolate for the 10-day period, absent a COVID negative test or absent a note from a doctor indicating it's something else. And putting something in place so that the district and the union leadership can feel comfortable that you're all on the same page as to what the intent is. And the intent is that you have teachers working with your kids as much as you can, so you don't have a sub in their place, but really making sure that that part of it is moving forward in collaboration with the union. In addition to that, I would also say that looking at the communication piece that you have with the board and the community, and for those of you who have switched to remote or going remote, making sure that you are keying with your parents and your board and the community as to, what the pivot is going to look like. So how are you going to move to the next phase? If you're going to have a phased in approach, how are you going to look at those metrics to make that determination? Now, I know many of you are waiting for specific metrics from your local health department, looking at what IDPH put out and thinking, how in the world does this apply to us? And okay, thanks, you've given this to us, but where's the dashboard we can look at so our community knows when we get there? And I think that's lessons learned, is that we all need to be communicating better with one another. We need ISB, we need IDPH, we need superintendents. You're all doing a fantastic job. I think the way you rely on each other is so important in terms of giving each other feedback. But I think that's another really important lesson learned. One thing I did hear from a very good superintendent friend of mine is that the only bad plan is a plan that can't change. So the idea being that you have to be willing to make adjustments as you go and set realistic expectations for your boards. Because you've got to remember, they are the 7 people who are volunteering for this very difficult position right now. And they have to understand how things are going to change, and that you might not always be able to give them all the information at once as to when the change is coming or why it's coming. So those are the big picture things that I think I'm seeing mostly right now.
Awesome. Dana, what are you seeing? What are your thoughts?
So I think in addition to making sure that, I mean, we've had keeping up with the guidance and updating things, I think the other important thing to do as you start is to review the communication plan, what you're going to do about these quarantines, what you're going to do if someone tests positive. And just to highlight something that PJ said earlier is, like, people are tired, people are emotional, and you can sort of, I think we have to adapt to that. We can't just say, buck up. I think the way to adapt to that is to make sure that you're sharing information and being as transparent as possible and not getting too far ahead of them. So giving people a preview of what's going to happen. You know, I think staff, a little example, a little anecdote I can give is I think staff are, all people that have ever sent kids to school or have worked in a school are used to, like, the letter, someone's got strep throat, or even more dreaded, someone has lice. And we're, like, down with that. But, like, employees need to understand that if they test positive, we're also going to have to send a letter. Again, not identifying them by name, and I think telling employees, especially employees that aren't teachers, this is what's going to happen. This is how we're going to handle it. You're going to work from home, or you're going to do this. This is what will happen to you. This is our plan. That reduces the anxiety for everybody, for staff, for parents, for your community, for your kids. So I think that was a critical thing that PJ mentioned earlier, that we're seeing to really have if you address it, it will have a positive effect.
Jennifer, how about you? What lessons are you hearing about?
I'm hearing a lot of feedback about student conduct and needing, especially in remote settings, and needing to come up with better ways to address student conduct and maybe better safeguards to avoid conduct issues. So whether it's, we've had some massive Zoom bombing incidents, things that I hadn't thought of that I'm hearing, perhaps the necessity of mandating Zoom backgrounds. You know, we've seen a lot of inappropriate things in the background of classes and how to handle that. So some districts are starting to think, do we even want to have access to what's behind, you know, what's going on behind, and thinking, and then also things like how you name yourself in a setting, who gets to speak in a setting, and just looking at options, trying to think more flexibly, what is discipline when you're remotely? So is being forced to be on mute, being forced to keep your screen off, not being able to do synchronous learning, what procedures apply to all that if you're going to remove people, or removing students from in-person and forcing remote. All of those are, I think, developing issues that, you know, there's not crystal clear legal guidance on, but certainly student behavior is driving the need to address it. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, we are definitely seeing and hearing of some interesting things these days of what's happening online. So Shelli mentioned one question that we received during registration, and thank you so much to those of you who submit questions that way. We really do appreciate them, and we use them when coming up with our questions that we want to ask. So another question that we received from registration dealt with the legal best practices or precautions that deal with technology. So very much in line with what Jennifer was just talking about. And so before we talk about that maybe a little bit more, PJ, can you tell us a bit more about how you're using technology for your hybrid learning option?
Sure. So we've decided to use Google and Google Classroom as our LMS, which is working really well, with the exception of there's a lot of issues with Google Meet in terms of some of the issues that Jennifer was mentioning earlier. So we've had some problems in trying to figure that out and to troubleshoot it. And it's surprising to me how behind Google Meet is in terms of Zoom, in terms of some of the protective features and controls it gives teachers at this point. So we have worked through that quite a bit. And then at the high school, we're streaming, and we're streaming into a for a synchronous experience for kids, but then the classes are being recorded into a private portal and then accessible for kids to access asynchronously with teacher permission as well. And so that has been, so far, it's working really well. Our parents have really appreciated it. The structure at all levels from K to 12 is significantly different than it was in the spring. And that's one of the things that, as a lesson learned, overall, the appreciation for the effort put in to make a dramatic transformation in what was remote instruction, which we called crisis instruction, really, from crisis instruction to what remote learning is today, your parents will feel. And so I joke that in the first day I got calls that, whoa, this is way, way too much. You know, you guys got to pull way back. And then other people still saying it's not enough, right? Like, so no matter what, you're going to have a little bit of bipolarization in your community. But for the most part, overwhelmingly, our community has noticed and appreciated the fact that we took the feedback as to what worked and didn't work in terms of communication and in terms of instruction, and we moved that forward and tried to implement the best that we can to best serve kids.
Great. And then Jennifer's already told us a little bit about some of the discipline concerns that arise when we're using technology to ease this transition. But for our attorneys, can you walk us through some of the other legal considerations that you're seeing during these times? Shelli?
Yeah, this is definitely, in terms of what we've been dealing with the unions with respect to what I think what PJ was just mentioning, and I think Jen mentioned about this recording component. And so this is obviously very different than what teachers typically experience in the classroom, this idea of being recorded. And we are seeing different responses from unions across the state as to their feeling about this. And I think some of the things that we need to think about here is, are you expecting a recording of the entire class? Are you allowing the teacher to pick a segment of the class that they're going to record? And then what are they going to be doing with it? So in terms of, for instance, is it going to impede student participation if they know that other students are going to be able to somehow access this post somewhere else? And we've already seen some kids take postings of things that both teachers have done and administrators that I'm aware of right now, and really modify that recording and put it out on social media. And I think kids being concerned that their classmates, despite being told that this is misconduct and they'll be disciplined for it, they shouldn't be doing that. So I think being mindful of that, being mindful of the fact that you likely have kids in the class who might be on the no photo list. So how do you handle that to make sure that they're not being identified? So I think those are some real issues that when you're working with the union and working with your community, understanding those are logistical pieces that need to be worked out and people need to be aware of before they are kind of, we're allowing the school into our homes during this process, and making sure that if it's being recorded, that there are very specific rules put in place for families as well as to how they should interact with that information and what should happen with that recording.
All right, jumping to you, Jennifer. What do you have? What are your thoughts on that?
So, I mean, one significant obstacle is the thought about how do we classify these recordings. And one position I want to clarify that we're comfortable legally is that they're not student records. So they're we're considering them instructional materials, and they're not student records because students are not, there was guidance at the beginning of this crisis from the department, the federal department that oversees student records issues, saying that if a student's not the primary focus of a video, that it is not necessarily their student record. So if they're not the primary focus and we use that video for something that targets the student, so we use it to discipline the student, then it might become a student record. But it would be absolutely unmanageable and unworkable if all of these were student records, because then that means there's maintenance requirements, there's production requirements. So we're as a starting place to understand, we're legally comfortable with the position that these are not student records, which opens up the door to, okay, they're instructional materials, you can destroy them, you can only keep them long enough to use them for instruction and then destroy them, and facilitates all those other things. So that's one, I think, legal hurdle that we're comfortable that we've jumped over, at least opens the door to the recordings. you do get to the union issues that Shelli was talking about and the other issues Dana was talking about, but it's doable. This is not legally, there's not barriers that make this unworkable.
Dana, what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I do think one of the most important things is is sort of having parameters for the recording. I do think it's a problem if we're recording whole classes and you see the students so much, you see a student struggling with a concept, you know, we want that's not necessarily, it's really, it may not be that beneficial for someone, first of all, and it's just, it might impact some privacy concerns, although I don't think there's a great amount of privacy in you know, we've had a lot of the other side of the coin of people not wanting to engage at all. I'll talk about like related service providers. I don't want to engage at all in speech because I'm doing something confidential. Well, helping someone say S and Z the right way is not necessarily confidential. I mean, I know that they view it that way and the records are confidential, but just like any other skill that you're teaching in the classroom, someone walking in and having a group of students, you know, doing the S and the Z sound is not top secret information that can't be done over video. And I think we have to err on the side of making things work for kids and getting them the services we need. So we're always looking at ways to do that legally.
There's so much to think about when it comes to the technology, for sure. But I know also there's a lot to consider when it comes to the physical issues once we're all in the building. So PJ, can you tell us about social distancing? How feasible are you finding it, and what steps are you taking to facilitate it in your building?
Well, this is part of what's been incredibly frustrating for me from the outset of this, and part of why I've been so outspoken is because the caveat of as possible in the guidance is infuriating to me. Because what does that actually mean? What are we held accountable for? Why does social distancing matter in the classroom but doesn't matter on a bus? All those inherent contradictions are a little bit frustrating. One of the things that we found is that when you go online, there's a lot of these online calculators of if you have this many square feet, there's so many people you can fit in with this amount of social distance. Those numbers we have not found to play out in reality, meaning that if it's 1,000 square foot room and X amount of kids fit in there, we actually fit the kids in there and try to keep them 6 feet apart. That number is actually a little bit lower because it's just not functional to have everyone perfectly spaced out. So I would say that we're doing a really good job in common times, in common areas where we can do things such as lunch, etc. But I'd say in the classrooms, we're not 6 feet all the time. I'd say we're probably more averaging around 5 feet and doing the best that we can. And so this has been my frustration with the guidance throughout, is that I will figure out a way to administer whatever is safe. I cannot determine what is safe if you don't tell me as the health professional. So that's been one of my gripes that I've said over and over again. If we had to adhere to the 6 feet, then we'd adhere to the 6 feet. I don't know that we'd be hybrid. I think we might be remote. And if that was a hard and fast rule. And I would also have tons of issues with the hypocrisy of the bus versus the classroom in that case. But we're doing the best that we can. I'd say we average around 5 feet. One of the issues for us is that when we split the alphabet to do half the kids in one day, half the kids the other day, that's what we had to do to make it work logistically for the district, but that's really impacted different buildings in different ways. So we are A through L heavy at elementary. We are L through Z heavy at the high school, so the distribution isn't exactly perfect, which would have allowed for some different spacing conundrums for us.
I want to follow up with that. This is an issue that I've gotten a lot of feedback on too, is the 6 foot of distance and when possible, as far as very high needs special ed students. So even if they're able to wear a mask, for instruction to be effective, some of it needs to be done within closer proximity than 6 foot. And I'm getting a lot of feedback that both paraprofessionals and teachers are very concerned and worried about, on one hand, if I keep the distance, they're not learning it. Yeah, they're here, but they're learning nothing. Or, they're trying to do kind of a dip in, do a little instruction, dip out, but we know that I think there's a lot of frustration building that we're not actually helping them. We can't help them unless we get closer than the 6 foot. And I don't actually have really good answers. Just I wanted to acknowledge that as a concern, you know. I don't know if you've seen any of that, PJ.
Yeah, so I can say for our experience, what happened, we had a music aide, so somebody that saw every student in the building on Friday as they rotated through for their special, that became symptomatic on Saturday. And so the way that, again, our hybrid works at the elementary is those kids that were in attendance Friday wouldn't have been back in attendance until today. And so we were when we did the contact tracing, the health department did the contact tracing, she said that she went up and down the rows. So she wasn't next to somebody for an extended period of time, but she was next to somebody all the time. So every kid had her next to him at some point. And so the guidance from the health department was that if she would have turned out positive, then we were not going to be able to operate school today because of potential exposure. Now, that's our health department. And again, like I said, they've been completely unpredictable to me. So I don't know if they'd do the same thing in a different situation. But for us, that's the risk you're playing, I guess, when you're not within 6 feet, is when you start to do that contact tracing, then instead of it being the teacher out, it becomes a classroom out. Now that's a risk that we've decided that we're going to take, right? Like that we're going to prioritize instruction to do it. And we have the sneeze guards and we're trying to do everything we can to protect the kids. But we're not going to keep we're not going to put the pool noodles on our teachers' heads and not let them get close to the kids or whatever you see in some of those videos from other countries.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly the decision is, okay, if we know that we're within 6 foot and it's within and we're going to rack up the 15 minutes really fast, well, then we know we're going to have to quarantine, it's going to get shut down pretty fast and so how much do we sacrifice keeping, risking the quarantine or keeping it in person? It's not, that's a hard call,
Yeah, well, the issue to stay open, and this is what I've tried to describe to my board, is I hope, and it's not, I hope that it's not going to be an outbreak that shuts us down. It's going to be the death by a million paper cuts that we're quarantining here, we're quarantining there, we're quarantining here. Oh, now we can't provide transportation. Oh, today we can't provide food service. Oh no, 4th grade today. Then all of a sudden, I think we're just going to be like, all right, this is enough. But that will be attrition, right? That'll be over time. And again, we're experiencing it. Like I said, today we have 50 people that aren't allowed to be at school. It's a lot when we haven't had a single positive case.
And I will raise the point that we received a comment and now the health experts are saying 20 feet distance, not 6 feet. So something else to keep in mind as we know that these things are always changing and they may change again. PJ, another big change that we're dealing with is that we now have this complicated self-certification requirement. So how are you implementing that at Meridian, and what advice do you have on how to do it?
Well, not as well as I would like. I think it would be. So we've partnered with an app, and it's worked really well for the people that are using it. But essentially, people have 3 options to get into our buildings. One is to allow us to health screen them. So temperature, and we ask, the 3 questions that we have to get in. The second is that they go through and fill out the self-certification, and then if you certify and you answer all the questions appropriately, which in our case is no, not yes, which is really confusing, apparently. Reading is hard. Then if you answer no to them, you get a big green screen that pops up on your phone that says may enter the date, time that it was filled out. And if you are a student K-5 and you don't have a phone to show and you don't want to do that on your Chromebook, you can print it out to enter. The issue for us is that in the spirit of health and wellness and in community health, we should be doing that before kids get on the bus. Logistically, there's no way for us to make that occur. We can't safely allow the bus drivers to be responsible for that. And when we posted for the position, we didn't get enough applicants and be able to add an additional adult to each bus. Additionally, so then the thought was we'd take our aides that would be at the school and put them on the buses. But with the screening that has to take place at the building and then the supervision of those kids, because they aren't allowed to do some of the things they typically were allowed to do, we needed the aides at the building site. So what's problematic for me, it's working really well with the exception of we could allow a symptomatic student on the bus without knowing it. And that occurred quite literally today. It wasn't a symptomatic student, but it was two siblings of a symptomatic student who should have been held home that got onto the buses. They weren't allowed into the buildings, but they were on the bus. So this is, again, everyone that I talk to is doing this in some sort of different way. And again, it depends on which guidelines you read, whether this is even a good idea or a poor idea in the first place. So for us, we found it to be much smoother at the buildings than you would expect. So if you haven't started yet, we thought we'd have these long lines. It would take forever. It's gone very, very smooth. Lots of volunteers out. So it hasn't been a problem at all in terms of getting kids into the building, which was a fear. We thought we'd have kids 10 and 20 minutes late. But it just, I don't know that it's serving the overall purpose that we want it to do.
That's really helpful on the practical realities of it. Dana, what about the legal concerns? Are you hearing anything with respect to self-certification as far as legal issues?
I think self-certification for some of the superintendents in the beginning, especially the small districts or especially districts, just many districts, they were worried about whether the parents had the ability to comply with it. Not that they wouldn't, but like, do people have, do they have thermometers that are reliable? Are people going to be able to do this every morning with the responsibilities that they may have otherwise to work or to care for younger children or to deal with something that's going on in the home? So I think that we had some people opt for certification at school, and that's possible, I think, in some of the really tiny, I'm sure, there's big school districts in Illinois and there's super tiny ones that have, like 100 students if they have that many. And that has been also, I'm envisioning this video game where you try to go every place and there's just a roadblock put in your way every time you try to go someplace. But that's been an issue because of the some staff are saying, if I'm screening people, don't I need special protective equipment? And I think that's a confusion in the guidance. If you're dealing with someone that's symptomatic, obviously they're saying if you're putting someone in an isolation space and you're going to exclude them from school, those people do need, if they're going to examine them or be close to them, they need that protective equipment, including the N95 mask and the gown. But just for screening, that's not in the guidance. I mean, I think there's still PPE required, but not the N95 mask. So that I think is a legal concern for many superintendents that are trying to make this work.
Yeah, I would just like to add, I think that dealing with and I always kind of go back to making sure that you're working with your staff on this and really understanding and making sure that there's open communication as to what actually is required, as opposed to this idea that you actually need the N95 mask, particularly because it does require particular fitting and all of that, but that's not required for all staff who are interacting with, any student, even those in the, isolation room if you have those. So just being clear as to what's legally required from the Department of Public Health, and not asking our superintendents to be public health experts on this issue and just follow what's out there to the extent that we can.
So it has been a couple of weeks since our masks webinar, which you are always able to find on our website or on our YouTube page. But now that we're back to school, let's talk about masks a little bit more. PJ, what process did you put in place to deal with mask exceptions or exemptions from students and staff?
So I was really concerned about masks. We tried to do a mini graduation ceremony where we allowed 5 people in at a time to walk across the stage to get the experience over summer, and we ended up having to call the police on people who refused to wear masks getting into the building. So, and that's indicative of my community. So my community has not warmed to the idea of people telling them what to do. So I thought we'd have an uphill battle when we started school, and we 100% have not. So for those of you that are worried about it, our kids have been compliant. Even the little ones have been good. When I talk to my kids, they say they forget about it by the end of the day. So there's muscle memory. Kids are amazing. Trust the process in that regard. I also had extreme fear that we'd find, like we do with some other things, that there'd be a doctor in town that would, essentially write the prescription that the students did not need to wear masks. We, at this point, have 0 mask exemptions for students and 1 for staff. And the one from a staff, so this was interesting with our lawyers working through the type of doctor that wrote the mask exemption. And so and I'll just leave it at that, so that if they get questionable ones, talk to your attorneys. They can help you on it. But So right now, again, between our 1,800 student and staff, we have one mask exemption, and I'm in a very anti-mask portion of the state, both ideologically and politically. So for us, it's been much better than I anticipated.
Jennifer, any legal updates on masks now that we are back or almost back to school?
Sure, I think we did that webinar right as the IDPH guidance had come out. There's also guidance that came out to pediatric healthcare providers. And I think that memo is, I mean, it includes some of the same language, but it also notes things like if there's a mask exemption, a heightened adherence to strict social distancing. And people might remember that our guidance was, okay, a mask exemption is the start of the conversation about what else needs to be done, not the end of the discussion, oh, you can just come to school without a mask. So I thought that guidance to the pediatric healthcare providers was somewhat helpful. I'd also know that there are districts out there who are getting the one doctor in town situation that are giving ridiculous, notes. I would just encourage people. So even if it's a properly qualified doctor and they give the mask exemption, like I said, that's the start of the conversation. Just like other notes from doctors, you consider it and then consider what accommodations need to be made. So in one situation, we had a doctor who wanted to say exactly what would, not just the mask exemption, but then what all the protocols would be in the school around it. Well, they don't have that authority over you. So definitely, and these are issues you really must push back depending on what your staff situation is and their comfort level. It's a deal breaker for some. So it's not a situation where, okay, we got a note from doctor, we're going to do whatever he said or she said.
Right, and just to back up what Jennifer said, I think the guidance that they put out, the Illinois Department of Health, is somewhat helpful on the guidance for healthcare providers. It really does discourage doctors from writing these things like, you have asthma, you had asthma 2 years ago, you can't wear a mask. So it does discourage that, and it is helpful in that regard. So I would look that up on the website if you have a minute and you're having an issue.
Okay, so Jennifer talked a little bit earlier about discipline and student conduct, but PJ, from a practical perspective, what are you seeing from your students in regards to misconduct this year?
Inappropriate avatars, inappropriate names when they log in, and with Google Meet, whoever opens the meeting has control of it. So if you have not opened yet, and we are a pretty Google sophisticated, we're a Google sophisticated district in terms of how many Google certified teachers and trainers we have. We just missed this. So whoever opens the Google Meet is who has control of it, meaning that they can kick people out and they cannot be kicked out. So when we have established our classrooms, the first couple of weeks were really difficult because kids would get there first and then they would play music or say something inappropriate, and then we couldn't get rid of them in that context. So obviously you kind of go through whatever process you have at that point, but it was definitely disruptive to the educational environment. So we found a few workarounds, a sophisticated way to work around it. So until we found the workarounds, we just, even though we're using Google Classroom as our LMS, we just went to Zoom until we kind of figured out a couple extensions that worked to help prohibit this. But that was it for us. And then in our area, and I'm embarrassed to say this, but we're working really hard on social justice and addressing race and becoming more anti-racist, but we have had a lot of Confederate flag and racially tinged language and names as people have identified themselves. And so that's been interesting for us to navigate through as to what we can direct and mandate and take care of and discipline on behalf of.
Yeah. I mean, as we were actually talking about, there's hate speech, there's going to be political speech, teachers. one of the main fears of teachers is they're going to be recorded and then put on Facebook and ridiculed. But I think, you know, just professional development in how to handle some of these situations, and really information out to the community about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. As the election comes closer, you know, I feel like you guys are dealing with a perfect storm, PJ, really. There's so many things going on at once, and just trying to keep ahead of it all. But that certainly is going to be a concern sort of in the virtual world, with all of these other things going on in the background and people so impacted by them. And just training for teachers, I think, on how to manage it initially, where to go, and how to also sort of manage their own, you know, social media presence so that it doesn't incite or enhance any bad feelings people might be having about school.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really astute reminder. So probably my two best regarded administrators, or most vocal administrators on my team, are both pretty vocal on anti-ends of the political spectrum. So it's funny because I get email complaints about both of them on their personal side, and it's appropriate, but it's tinged, right? Like, and so there's never been a time where it's been more heightened, I guess, is my reason for saying that. So if you're not dealing with it now, you will be at some point. I would most assuredly guess in the next, 90 days or so.
So any other thoughts on what we should be thinking about as far as how to control this kind of behavior? Jennifer, any thoughts there?
No, I mean, I do know districts are rethinking their student codes of conduct and what, I was talking to a district who mandated, like you said, the names, how you get named. They made that automatic from their student records pull so that they couldn't have hijinks in that area. Like I said, the idea about the Zoom backgrounds, we are getting, First Amendment speech questions are so complex, and it depends who. So just because we give advice for students doesn't mean that exactly applies to teachers, or there's a difference between what you're communicating within your curriculum versus what you just post as speech, like on your mask or shirt or a background sign. So, I don't want to not do it justice in just a 1 minute blurb, but these are really complicated issues. You can get into some serious legal hot water. So just watch, get some guidance on that if you're facing those issues, because it's endlessly complicated, the legal issues in this area.
I think a really good way, though, to make sure that you're really addressing it and to get in front of it is to, and I think I mentioned this earlier, is just the communication to parents and students about what is and is not appropriate and how the district will respond to it. I think most districts across the state are doing a really good job of this. As most of you know who are listening, I have a freshman going into ETHS, and we received a whole bunch of information about what the expectations were going to be for remote learning for him, and making sure that you're doing things to have parents work with the kids on what the expectations are going to be and what's going to lead to misconduct, even in this virtual world. So
one of the things that we've done, which has been pretty successful, and again, I'm small, so I know the kids differently than I know a district with 30,000 kids would be. But when we have a question, what I do, which I think Jennifer was alluding to, but said it very politely, was don't mess it up. Just call your attorneys and let them tell you what to do. Is typically the mechanism that we use. But then I'll reach out to the student and say, look, I'm not telling you what to do at this point. I may be in the future, but what I'm doing right now is asking you as a favor to me, do this because it's disrupting a couple kids' learning. And I have almost 100% success when I reach out and do that at the individual level without a mandate or punishment or consequence. And I try to have a learning conversation with the student. And that way, even if we get pushback, because sometimes attorneys take a while to get back to you, that, hey, it's been 3 days, what are you doing about this? Then I can say, look, I've had a personal conversation with the student. Now we're just waiting on our attorneys to fill in the blanks. And it makes it a much easier way to respond, as opposed to just say, hey, we're just waiting on it.
Yeah, and I think that just sort of renews my faith in teaching and learning, is that's always the first response, right? Like, whether you have 30,000 kids or 3,000 kids, you need somebody, if it's not the superintendent, somebody on the ground that can make that connection with the student. Because I think, as Shelli aptly pointed out, you have to tell them they don't know. I do remember like being, a young teacher and someone telling me, you have to tell them everything they don't know. And that was like simple, yet very profound. So I think that's a maxim that we have to go back to.
Yeah, well, and as you all know, we here at Franczek take a lot of pride in how quickly we get back to all of you. So do not hesitate to reach out if you need a quicker response from one of us. Okay, so one of the questions we received in our registration process was, how were you able to prioritize the new guidelines from IDPH to open your school? So PJ, I know that you've talked a lot about how the things are always changing. How have you struck the balance or dealt with other challenges relating to IDPH and the changes in guidance?
So I think that what was very clear from our community is that they wanted us to, at minimum, attempt to do in-person instruction. And so with that as the basis of, we have to figure out how to do this as safe as possible, as opposed to whether or not to do it, helped us move forward, I think, quicker than some districts, because whether or not to do instruction is a decision that I have to work with my bargaining units and work with my board and community and whatever else. And so if I tried to help make that be an independent process from how we were going to try to implement the guidance. And so what I did was I charged the rest of my cabinet level staff to say, you don't need to worry about whether or not we're going to do school. That's for me to do. And then we can have some of those meetings independently. But what you need to do is how we are going to implement this. And separating that and empowering my people to go forward and figure out how we could do it to the best of our abilities worked pretty well for us. I think we've come up with a plan that is suitable. I don't think it's a perfect plan. But in what I've shared with anyone, and I've shared this with my community, is that our plan isn't perfect. But I'm really, really proud of the process we used to create the plan. And so since the process was strong, that means that we enfranchise students, parents, and our staff in doing so. So even if it fails, it's kind of like we all failed together. And so the prioritization really worked through in a collaborative process to say, all right, we are going to attempt to do in-person instruction at some level. How can we do it the safest and most effective manner?
Now, we got some great questions, and I want to get to them. We're going to have a little bit of a lightning round here at the end of our questions that we received in the Q&A. But I did want to say or ask about one thing that we talked about during our prep session that I thought was really interesting and important, which is about whether there are any groups of students, special populations of students that, PJ, you've been thinking about, and how are their needs being met at this time?
Sure. So corresponding to all the work with the pandemic, and we kind of alluded to this before, social justice work is happening in most of our schools, or at least it's on the back burner if it's not happening now. And so one of the learning that I had over the summer is basically with every decision, you're either promoting, equity or really leveraging inequity. And so as we created the plan, what we realized is that the remote process, while we think is significantly improved than it was in the past, is still disadvantageous for some groups of our students more so than it is for others. And so when we looked at that, for our kids, it's our students with 504, our IEPs, and our English language learners. So for us, those students are attending 4 days a week. So they're not in the hybrid. We shut down everything Wednesday for cleaning. So any day that we have school happening, those students have the, now we haven't mandated it, right? So if the parents don't want to do that, then we still are offering the other, but what we have afforded them the opportunity to get to school every single day so that we can try to ensure that we're not perpetuating the gaps and perpetuating the inequity that we're trying to close those.
All right, I'm going to go through some of these questions that we received pretty quickly, and we'll try to get to them all. So we had a question, is there a model affidavit parents can sign acknowledging they have read all health protocols? Shelli?
No, I'm not aware of an actual affidavit out there, but I would say that the same way you have parents sign off on your student handbook, make this similar to that in terms of acknowledgement that they have read it, they understood what the rules are. And I would say that's both for health and safety as well as for any sort of virtual learning that you're doing.
All right, another question we received was, given the understandable stress and exhaustion of teachers and other staff, what types of additional support are you providing or hoping to provide to them? So PJ, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that one.
So I think we're just being mindful as much as possible. The two best tips I've received to help with this that my teachers have responded to is one I got from a teacher at Evanston Township High School, which was, I've been waiting for somebody to ask me how I feel individually for 5 months. And so what we've been doing is just sending individual emails and cards to people, just asking them how they're feeling. And that has gone over really well, as opposed to, because we're all doing it at the macro level, right? Like, hey, we've had a great first day, let me know what we can do, but something personally addressed to them and indicates that you actually value their opinion. The second thing, which is taken a ton off of our teachers' plate, and we stole this off of Twitter, it's just a random idea that we found, but we've encouraged them to set their away message to answer the frequently asked questions, particularly pertaining to remote learning. So if you don't know what my assignment is, check here. So instead of having to return all those emails, the auto return is answering the frequently asked questions, and it's been a huge time saver for our staff at this point.
Sure. You know, I'm not a district administrator, but sometimes we take a lot of administrator and staff time. And I know I feel myself being very, very protective, you know, and pushing back on those third parties that are always after your time, that we're a little bit gatekeepers too. So right now, I mean, I just sent an email this morning, like, this is literally the biggest crisis to ever happen to health or schools. You can wait on your whatever it is. Give us a few weeks to get, you know, school open. So.
And one of the things that was different for me that I just misjudged in the spring was that I did not want to set a lot of expectations because I wanted people to process through it. And what I learned is that by not setting expectations is that my teachers did everything, and they had a really hard time setting boundaries on their own. So we've set firmer expectations and schedules, which I thought would have been, I would have rebelled against as a teacher personally, but what it's done is it's allowed for structure enough that they can set boundaries and turn off the computer at certain times and still go be a mom, a dad, a husband, a wife.
We could use some advice on that, us lawyers here on this call, I know as well. So we know how hard that is. So we had another question of, per a very recent change, the CDC no longer recommends testing for those who come in contact with individuals who've tested positive. How has or will this change guidance to schools? Dana, do you have thoughts on that?
It will not, at least not right now, until the Illinois Department of Health puts out something that says they're not going to do that. And I have not heard you can still get a test if you've been in contact, if you want a test. These are what the reports are saying. And we need to follow the local, it's back to the local guidance is really where you're going to go first, not the CDC. So that was a news story today, but I think we're still under the guidance that if you have an exposure to someone who is positive or someone who's presumed positive, and you're either going to quarantine for the whole period or you're going to get a test. So tests are still out there and are still recommended under our local guidance.
PJ, we got a question about whether you've had any confirmed student or staff COVID cases that were contracted at your school that are known publicly. Were you able to stay open? How did the public react? One of our worries is that when we move to in-person, we will inevitably have a case, and then how do we keep our community confident in our model?
So we've had multiple positive cases, but they were all right at the outset of school, and none of the students or staff had been in their official capacity at the time that they're positive. So obviously they didn't come from school then, and then we didn't have to go through the contact tracing and shutting down. So our community's it's been really interesting. So again, my community is a little bit different, and they think that this is overblown. So it's been really important for us to be really transparent with how much we've not only sharing with them the data of who has COVID and not, how many people are quarantined, and then how many are symptomatic. They want that separated. But for me, what in a very fiscally conservative area, when I demonstrate to them the quarantine has cost us this many man hours and this much labor, and this is how much it's cost us to reopen, that data is more important to them right now than the health and wellness data. So keep hitting them with both, but that way they're fully informed. Again, my presumption is that eventually we'll be full remote, whether it's for a 2-week period or a 4-month period. And so I'm constantly building that case for that when we go there, I can say, look, we've been telling you that this is coming throughout the course, as opposed to they're going to say it just was sprung on them at the last second.
Jackie, if I can just add one thing before we close, I think that in terms of that question is how you retain the confidence of the community is by communication. The idea that you'd have a positive case and wouldn't put that out to the community and let them know, with obviously not disclosing personal information, but they want to know that, and they want to know that you're on top of it and you know how to handle it as the district in line with the IDPH guidance. And I think that's how you maintain the confidence of your community, is that you are being transparent with them about the information you have and how you're going to go about dealing with it.
All right, everyone, we are at 1 o'clock. It's here before we knew it. I know we didn't get to all of your questions, but you can always call us if you'd like to chat about any of the questions that you had that didn't get answered. PJ, thank you so much for joining us, especially when you are dealing with as much as you're dealing both at home and at school right now. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. It was fun.
And for everyone who joined us, thank you so much for joining. As we mentioned, you can always find the recordings of these webinars that you can share with others, or if you need to catch up on anything you missed, you can find those on our website at franczek.com. And we will see you next week for FAPE in fall 2020. Until then, please take care. Thanks, everyone.